Chapter 5 of The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy. In this way 1 month, then a second passed by. Just before the New Year his brother-in-law arrived in the town on a visit to them. Ivan Ilyich was at the court when he arrived. Praskovya Fyodorovna had gone out shopping. Coming home and going into his study, he found there his brother-in-law, a healthy, florid man, engaged in unpacking his trunk. He raised his head, hearing Ivan Ilyitch's step, and for a second stared at him without a word. That stare told Ivan Ilyich everything. His brother-in-law opened his mouth to utter an "Oh!" of surprise, but checked himself. That confirmed it all. "What, have I changed?" "Yes, there is a change." And all Ivan Ilyitch's efforts to draw him into talking of his appearance, his brother-in-law met with obstinate silence. Praskovya Fyodorovna came in. The brother-in-law went to see her. Ivan Ilyich locked his door and began gazing at himself in the looking-glass, first full face, then in profile. He took up his photograph, taken with his wife, and compared the portrait with what he saw in the looking-glass. The change was immense. Then he bared his arm to the elbow, looked at it, pulled the sleeve down again, sat down on an ottoman, and felt blacker than night. I mustn't, he said to himself, jumped up, went to the table, opened some official paper, tried to read it, but could not. He opened the door, went into the drawing-room. The door into the drawing-room was closed. He went up to it on tiptoe and listened. "No, you're exaggerating," Praskovya Fyodorovna was saying. "Exaggerating? You can't see it. Why, he's a dead man. Look at his eyes. There's no light in them. But what's wrong with him?" "No one can tell. Nikolaev," that was another doctor, "said something, but I don't know. Leschetitsky," this was the celebrated doctor, "said the opposite." Ivan Ilyich walked away, went to his own room, lay down, and fell to musing. A kidney, a loose kidney. He remembered all the doctors had told him, how it had been detached and how it was loose, and by an effort of imagination he tried to catch that kidney and to stop it, to strengthen it. So little was needed, he fancied. "No, I'll go again to Pyotr Ivanovitch." This was the friend who had a friend a doctor. He rang, ordered the horse to be put in, and got ready to go out. "Where are you off to, Jean?" asked his wife, with a peculiarly melancholy and exceptionally kind expression. This exceptionally kind expression exasperated him. He looked darkly at her. "I want to see Pyotr Ivanovitch." He went to the friend who had a friend a doctor, and with him to the doctor's. He found him in and had a long conversation with him. Reviewing the anatomical and physiological details of what, according to the doctor's view, was taking place within him, he understood it all. It was just one thing, a little thing wrong with the intestinal appendix. It might all come right. Only strengthen one sluggish organ and decrease the undue activity of another, and absorption would take place, and all would be set right. He was a little late for dinner. He ate his dinner, talked cheerfully, but it was a long while before he could go to his own room to work. At last he went to his study, and at once sat down to work. He read his legal documents and did his work, but the consciousness never left him of having a matter of importance very near to his heart which he had put off, but would look into later. When he had finished his work, he remembered that the matter near his heart was thinking about the intestinal appendix. But he did not give himself up to it. He went into the drawing-room to tea. There were visitors, and there was talking, playing on the piano, and singing. There was the young examining magistrate, the desirable match for the daughter. Ivan Ilyich spent the evening, as Praskovya Fyodorovna observed, in better spirits than any of them, but he never forgot for an instant that he had the important matter of the intestinal appendix put off for consideration later. At 11 o'clock he said good night and went to his own room. He had slept alone since his illness in a little room adjoining his study. He went in, undressed, and took up a novel of Zola, but did not read it. He fell to thinking. And in his imagination the desired recovery of the intestinal appendix had taken place. There had been absorption, rejection, re-establishment of the regular action. "Why, it's all simply that," he said to himself. "One only wants to assist nature." He remembered the medicine, got up, took it, lay down on his back, watching for the medicine to act beneficially and overcome the pain. "It's only to take it regularly and avoid injurious influences. Why, already I feel rather better, much better." He began to feel his side. It was not painful to the touch. "Yes, I don't feel it. Really, much better already." He put out the candle and lay on his side. "The appendix is getting better. Absorption." Suddenly he felt the familiar, old, dull, gnawing ache, persistent, quiet, in earnest. In his mouth the same familiar loathsome taste. His heart sank, his brain felt dim, misty. "My God, he said. "Again, again, and it will never cease." And suddenly the whole thing rose before him in quite a different aspect. "Intestinal appendix, kidney," he said to himself. "It's not a question of the appendix, not a question of the kidney, but of life and death. Yes, life has been, and now it's going away, and I cannot stop it. Yes, why deceive myself? Isn't it obvious to everyone except me that I'm dying? And it's only a question of weeks, of days, at once perhaps. There was light, and now there is darkness. I was here, and now I am going. Where?" A cold chill ran over him. His breath stopped. He heard nothing but the throbbing of his heart. "I shall be no more. Then what will there be? There'll be nothing. Where then shall I be when I'm no more? Can this be dying? No, I don't want to." He jumped up, tried to light the candle, and fumbling with trembling hands, he dropped the candle and the candlestick on the floor, and fell back again on the pillow. "Why trouble? It doesn't matter," he said to himself, staring with open eyes into the darkness. "Death. Yes, death. And they, all of them, don't understand, and don't want to understand, and feel no pity. They are playing." He caught through the closed doors the faraway cadence of a voice and the accompaniment. "They don't care, but they will die too. Fools! Me sooner and them later, but it will be the same for them. And they are merry, the beasts!" Anger stifled him, and he was agonizingly, insufferably miserable. "It cannot be that all men always have been doomed to this awful horror." He raised himself. "There is something wrong in it. I must be calm, I must think it all over from the beginning." And then he began to consider. "Yes, the beginning of my illness. I knocked my side, and I was just the same that day and the days after. It ached a little, and then more, then doctors, then depression, misery, and again doctors, and I've gone on getting closer and closer to the abyss. Strength growing less. Nearer and nearer. And here I am, wasting away, no light in my eyes. I think of how to cure the appendix, but this is death. Can it be death?" Again a horror came over him. Gasping for breath, he bent over, began feeling for the matches, and knocked his elbow against the bedside table. It was in his way, and hurt him. He felt furious with it, and his anger knocked against it more violently, and upset it. And in despair, breathless, he fell back on his spine, waiting for death to come that instant. The visitors were leaving at that time. Praskovya Fyodorovna was seeing them out. She heard something fall and came in. "What is it?" "Nothing. I dropped something by accident." She went out, brought a candle. He was lying, breathing hard and fast, like a man who has run a mile, and staring with fixed eyes at her. "What is it, Jean?" "Nothing, I say. I dropped something." "Why speak? She won't understand," he thought. She certainly did not understand. She picked up the candle, lighted it for him, and went out hastily. She had to say good-bye to a departing guest. When she came back he was lying in the same position on his back, looking upwards. "How are you? Worse?" "Yes." She shook her head, sat down. "Do you know what, Jean? I wonder if we hadn't better send for Leschetizky to see you here." This meant calling in the celebrated doctor regardless of expense. He smiled malignantly and said no. She sat a moment longer, went up to him, and kissed him on the forehead. He hated her with all the force of his soul when she was kissing him, and had to make an effort not to push her away. "Good night. Please God you'll sleep." "Yes." Chapter 6 of The Death of Ivan Ilyich. Ivan Ilyich saw that he was dying, and was in continual despair. At the bottom of his heart Ivan Ilyich knew that he was dying, but so far from growing used to this idea, he simply did not grasp it. He was utterly unable to grasp it. The example of the syllogism that he had learned in Kiesewetters' logic, Caius is a man, men are mortal, therefore Caius is mortal, had seemed to him all his life correct only as regards Caius, but not at all as regards himself. In that case it was a question of Caius, a man, an abstract man, and it was perfectly true, but he was not Caius, and was not an abstract man. He had always been a creature quite different from all others. He had been little Vanya, with a mamma and papa, and Mitya and Volodya, with playthings and a coachman and a nurse. Afterwards with Katenka, with all the joys and griefs and ecstasies of childhood, boyhood, and youth. What did Caius know of the smell of the leathern ball Vanya had been so fond of? Had Caius kissed his mother's hand like that? Caius had not heard the silk rustle of his mother's skirts. He had not made a riot at school over the pudding. Had Caius been in love like that? Could Caius preside over the sittings of the court? And Caius certainly was mortal, and it was right for him to die. But for me, little Vanya, Ivan Ilyich, with all my feelings and ideas, for me it's a different matter. And it cannot be that I ought to die. That would be too awful. That was his feeling. If I had to die like Caius, I should have known it was so. Some inner voice would have told me so. But there was nothing of the sort in me, and I and all my friends, we felt that it was not at all the same as with Caius. And now here it is, he said to himself. It can't be. It can't be, but it is. How is it? How's one to understand it? And he could not conceive it, and tried to drive away this idea as false, incorrect, and morbid, and to supplant it by other, correct, healthy ideas. But this idea, not as an idea merely, but as it were an actual fact, came back again and stood confronting him. And to replace this thought he called up other thoughts, one after another, in the hope of finding support in them. He tried to get back into former trains of thought, which in old days had screened off the thought of death. But strange to say, all that had in old days covered up, obliterated the sense of death, could not now produce the same effect. Latterly Ivan Ilyich spent the greater part of his time in these efforts to restore his old trains of thought which had shut off death. At one time he would say to himself, "I'll put myself into my official work. Why, I used to live in it." And he would go to the law courts, banishing every doubt. He would enter into conversation with his colleagues, and would sit carelessly, as his old habit was, scanning the crowd below dreamily, and with both his wasted hands he would lean on the arms of the oak armchair just as he always did, and bending over to a colleague, pass the papers to him and whisper to him. Then suddenly dropping his eyes and sitting up straight, he would pronounce the familiar words that opened the proceedings. But suddenly, in the middle, the pain in his side, utterly regardless of the stage he had reached in his conduct of the case, began its work. It riveted Ivan Ilyitch's attention. He drove away the thought of it, but it still did its work. And then it came, and stood confronting him, and looked at him, and he felt turned to stone, and the light died away in his eyes, and he began to ask himself again, "Can it be that it is the only truth?" And his colleagues and his subordinates saw with surprise and distress that he, the brilliant, subtle judge, was losing the thread of his speech, was making blunders. He shook himself, tried to regain his self-control, and got, somehow, to the end of the sitting, and went home with the painful sense that his judicial labors could not, as of old, hide from him what he wanted to hide, that he could not, by means of his official work, escape from it. And the worst of it was that it drew him to itself, not for him to do anything in particular, but simply for him to look at it straight in the face, to look at it, and, doing nothing, suffer unspeakably. And to save himself from this, Ivan Ilyitch sought amusements, other screens, and these screens he found, and for a little while they did seem to save him. But soon again they were not so much broken down as let the light through, as though it pierced through everything, and there was nothing that could shut it off. Sometimes during those days he would go into the drawing-room he had furnished, that drawing-room where he had fallen, for which, how bitterly ludicrous it was for him to think of it, for the decoration of which he had sacrificed his life, for he knew that it was that bruise that had started his illness. He went in and saw that the polished table had been scratched by something. He looked for the cause, and found it in the bronze clasps of the album which had been twisted on one side. He took up the album, a costly one, which he had himself arranged with loving care, and was vexed at the carelessness of his daughter and her friends. Here a page was torn, here the photographs had been shifted out of their places. He carefully put it to rights again, and bent the clasp back. Then the idea occurred to him to move all this établissement of the albums to another corner where the flowers stood. He called the footman, or his daughter or his wife came to help him. They did not agree with him, contradicted him. He argued, got angry. But all that was very well, since he did not think of it. It was not in sight. But then his wife would say, as he moved something himself, "Do let the servants do it, you'll hurt yourself again." And all at once it peeped through the screen. He caught a glimpse of it. He caught a glimpse of it, but still he hoped it would hide itself. Involuntarily, though, he kept watch on his side. There it is just the same still, aching still. And now he cannot forget it, and it is staring openly at him from behind the flowers. What's the use of it all? And it's the fact that here, at that curtain, as if it had been storming a fort, I lost my life. Is it possible? How awful and how silly! It cannot be. It cannot be, and it is. He went into his own room, lay down, and was again alone with it. Face to face with it, and nothing to be done with it. Nothing but to look at it and shiver.